Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics and, of course, the topic of, well, the month, the year, whatever, is Brexit, of course. And the vote to vote for the Brexit deal that Theresa May has put forward was postponed. It was supposed to be earlier this week. It's now been postponed. It looks very much like Theresa May is wanting to do this on the 21st of January to give it the maximum amount of time. And what I'm going to do is basically go from what I think are my 5 reasons why I think she's making a big mistake. And I don't just mean why it's bad to put it on that much later for the country, but potentially for her as well. The first reason is it just seems to me to be a huge gamble on her part. What she's attempting to do, as far as I can tell, is 2 things. First of all, give herself the maximum amount of time to try and persuade as many people as possible to vote this deal through. And at the same time, by leaving it as late as she dare, it's coming, at that point, it'll be like 2 and a bit months away from end date. And a few MPs might sweat a bit and think, well, actually, if we vote this down, the consequences could be even more dire. So maybe we'll vote it through. But this isn't realistic because there are a good 80 Tory MPs at least that will definitely vote this deal down. There are also the 10 DUP MPs who the Prime Minister relies upon to get her legislation through that will also vote it down. So what the DUP have actually said in an interview today, a few little snippets. So it says that they've held up their end of the deal. It says, we have delivered on the deal. She got 50% of the votes on the Brexit legislation through as a result of our support. 20% of her domestic legislation wouldn't have gone through without our support. And the break in the agreement has not been by us. So what they then go on to say is, it's been broken by the Prime Minister who promised she would not separate Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom and then went away and negotiated such an arrangement. So what are they talking about there? The idea of the backstop, this is the sticking point, that in order to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a key feature of, well, frankly, life in Ireland, but in particular of the Good Friday Agreement, in order to prevent that happening, what they really need to do is to make sure that goods and services in Northern Ireland the standards are in line with EU standards. And the only way to do that is to make sure that they effectively remain part of like the customs union. And that is only going to apply to Northern Ireland, or at least that is the plan, or that was the plan. Only going to apply to Northern Ireland. What that effectively does is put a border up the Irish Sea, something a lot of MPs were dead against. Effectively, you create a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So does this deal separate it? Yes, it does. The alternative, which Theresa May talked about as well, was applying this to the whole United Kingdom. So then you could argue maybe the DUP would be okay with that. I'm not sure because they may have philosophical disagreements with that. But what I definitely know is that there's still going to be a lot of MPs not happy about that as well, including those 80 Tory MPs who would still vote it down. So the bottom line is, in order to get her deal through, she's going to rely upon 80 or 90, depending on exactly what the deal is going to be, opposition MPs to vote in favour of it. Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the largest party in the opposition, would not sanction that. In fact, I'm pretty sure he will tell his MPs to vote against it. So MPs would have to rebel against him to vote in favour of the deal. There may be a very small number who would do that. Not because there's only a small number who are prepared to rebel against Jeremy Corbyn. After all, he did it all the time when he was a backbencher. But just because most of them don't want this deal either. And the reason why he will direct them to sink it is because he believes that's the best chance to arrange for a general election, through which, of course, Labour could potentially form a government. So the arithmetic, as she was herself saying, is simply not there. She cannot get this deal through, even by leaving it to the 21st, and by leaving it so late. She's basically gambling that a lot of MPs will be sweating and just hit the button because it will seem safer than anything else. The second thing is that there are not going to be any changes to that deal. If she was going to suggest that she's leaving it until then, to try and get some changes from it. Well, one, she's not even trying to pretend that she's trying to get changes. She keeps talking. She talked a couple of days ago about getting assurances from European leaders. She said the same thing today in Brussels. She's getting assurances. MPs have already made it clear assurances aren't good enough. Politicians do not trust the promises of other politicians. Only the electorate are that dumb. So without changes, it cannot go through the House. It's not going to change anyone's mind. The only reason, for example, those 80-ish Tory MPs would vote it is if there were substantial changes to it, and they're not going to be. Various heads of member states, EU member states, have already said there's to be no renegotiation. The president of the EU has said exactly the same thing. Theresa May is not even attempting to get a renegotiation, at least not publicly. Who knows what goes behind closed doors? But the last thing the EU is going to want to do is to allow the sort of change that would bring the rest of her party on side and all of her MPs and the DUP would vote for, because that's what's required. The change that would be required to do that, first of all, I don't believe such a deal exists. I think it's fantasy what people are even asking for. But even if it did exist, someone supremely clever came up with some cunning plan that has not occurred to anyone as yet, the EU would be seen to have backed down. The EU does not have a history of doing this. When they get into tough negotiations, they don't really have a history of blinking on this. The third thing is that the government has had to prioritise Brexit over domestic policy. It's got to. Obviously Brexit is by far the most important historical event for Britain since the start of the Second World War in 1939. But the issue is, of course, there's an awful lot of, effectively, the governing of the country, which is what the government is supposed to be doing, has not been happening to the same degree because Brexit has taken precedent. In fact, the Cabinet Secretary, who is the most senior civil servant, has basically said this. What he said was, some departments have, for example, paused some of their domestic policy agenda in order to focus their attention on planning for 29th of March. That partly reflects the nature of their Brexit portfolio compared to others. Obviously, some departments have a much bigger deal than others, like the Department of Education. Brexit's not that big a deal for them, whereas the Department of Transport, for example, big deal. So partly reflects the nature of blah, blah, blah compared to others. Each department essentially needs to make its own judgment between the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary about what their capacity is to deliver. But essentially, the Brexit agenda is incorporated alongside the rest of the department's agenda, but is of a higher priority. And until Brexit is sorted, then when the government is not going to be able to turn its attention to the sort of domestic agenda that Theresa May was trying to talk about in her speech, the one that I sort of blasted yesterday. So the sooner we get it through, the better. So delaying a vote, because we know what's going to happen when the vote goes through, unless by some, I don't even know what would have to happen for enough MPs to vote this deal through. So it's going to be the same result, but now is going to be, it'll be effectively about 6 weeks less time to do something about it. That is not going to help the government actually keep its eye on what's going on in the country, because we're constantly looking what's going on outside of the country and how it's going to relate to us. The fourth thing is that despite claims that plans for no deal are advanced, they are anything but. Here is what has happened. So there's a little report here saying Esther McVey, who's a Tory backbencher, she used to be a minister, was asking what is being done. And the only response she got was from the Commons leader, Andrea Leadsom, who says, ministers are doing everything we need to do for every outcome and a no-deal preparation is well advanced. No, it's not. The most pressing concerns, if we crashed out with, say, no deal, the most pressing concerns would surely be in the first few days, security, border security, and trade, getting lorries in and out of ports and ships and all the rest of it. Getting things into and out of the country. That includes people, but most especially things. But then the things have to be brought by people. And as I've already talked about, there has not been any increase in capacity of either of those things. They haven't massively increased border security, which they're going to have to do, because we haven't got anyone looking out for our borders in the EU anymore. or we won't do. And then the other thing is, of course, I've already talked about this, is getting lorries in. So Dover, for example, this is something that, remember, the previous Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, only just before he quit, only just cottoned onto. He said he had no idea what the issue was with Dover Port, which was astounding because it was even reported in headline news months and months ago. The issue is this: we get an awful lot of our food in particular, and that's what we're going to be mostly focusing on, the things we need immediately to live, from the EU. We don't produce anywhere near enough ourselves. We export most of our food. So we get a lot of that in from the EU. In fact, most of it, let's be honest. So, and travelling food, of course, food will eventually spoil. You can do what you can to keep it fresh, but it will eventually spoil. You need to get it in quickly. Now, the bulk of that comes in through Dover. And those lorries, according to someone who sort of works there, they say about 8 minutes to get through. And there's a random sample check, but effectively, there's no real checking because we're all part of the EU. But there's a random sample of about 1% that will be checked, just because. And and that facility is up to bursting point already. It's up to a maximum capacity. There is no extra capacity there. You'd have to increase that checking by 100-fold, but we can't. We don't have the people. We don't have the space. We don't have the facilities to do that. And there hasn't been any increase in that. So what the people who are actually working at the port now say is, they're saying to themselves, with no deal, their business is gone in 4 months' time. That's all there is to it. They have no business, because what will happen is it will not just take 8 minutes to get through. It will take days, potentially over a week to get through. Well, from the point of view of food, then that's spoiled. And then even from the point of view of other goods that, okay, in theory could stay a week, not only does that raise the cost massively of transport, you're actually not going to get the lorry drivers to do it. The lorry drivers are going to say, don't send me on that run, send me to Belgium or wherever the hell. They're not going to do it. So because we haven't increased that capacity, we can't even try and trade at the same sort, or anywhere near the same sort of volumes. We can literally only trade at 1% of current capacity, because that's the only capacity we have for checking. That's it. And getting people through in a reasonable amount of time. Maybe you could up it to 2% if people would be willing to spend 16 minutes getting through it all. And then the final thing is just how we appear to the rest of the world. We risk making ourselves look even more moronic than we already have done, because it's a huge gamble she's staking everything on here, unless she's got a cunning plan. Maybe she's been really cunning. She wants it to fail, and she wants there to be so little time to do something else. There is no other deal possible. I mean, let's think about the options now. It's not, at this point, there are now very few options, so it's quite easy to quickly recap them again. So the deal, Theresa May's deal, that's what the EU will accept. So we accept that, do we? No. Okay. So then there's no deal. Do we accept that? No, because that's madness. And then the third thing is extending the deadline. But then what are we going to extend it for? Because we can't come up with another deal. We could extend it for another 2 years. Can't come up with another deal because that's the only deal they're going to accept. That's what they've said. And then actually someone did say in the comments yesterday that the EU wouldn't allow an extension to it. Now, it's possible. They may actually, because if you think about it this way, if we decided to play hardball, and we haven't thus yet, but if we did, because we know we have the unilateral right to cancel Article 50 and stay in the EU, we could, in theory, someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I see no reason why we couldn't do this. We could, in theory, cancel it and then reinstate it a few months later and trigger the 2-year thing again. We could piss about endlessly. So I actually imagine the EU, to prevent this farce, would actually allow an extension. But again, what's that extension going to do? It's not going to allow us to get a different deal. It's simply going to keep us in the EU until we've come up with a sensible solution to the whole problem. I don't believe a solution exists, particularly to the Northern Ireland issue, in which case all you can do is give yourself more time for a referendum, because that's your third choice. That's all there is to it. Those are the only choices. May's deal, no deal, referendum. And what if the referendum came back and it was still in favour of leave? Now, many people don't believe it would be, But let's say it was. What they'd have to do for the referendum is ask very clear questions. Do you want to remain in the EU? Do you want to leave? But then after it, say, do you want to leave the EU with no deal, or do you want to leave it but remain in the single market? So that would be better than May's deal. We'd have the Norway deal. It would cost us a lot of money, but that's for another video. But the problem now is that we're going to have this situation where we're leaving it to the last minute. No one really knows what's going on. Businesses can't even plan. How can businesses plan for April, which is now only a few months away, when they have zero idea what the trade conditions are going to be like? They have no idea. I mean, are you asking businesses who maybe manufacture things to sell in Europe, are we asking them to purchase things to outside of Britain to make these things and then, you know, not be able to sell them? Just the uncertainty can be throwing businesses down, and we just look just to the international community, we just look like cretins, and that is also not being helped by this decision either. So those are my 5 reasons. Over the 5th one went into, I think, 3 different ones really. My 5 reasons why I think that we should still have the vote before Christmas. We shouldn't have postponed it in the first place, and I don't think it was even in Theresa May's interest to postpone it. I mean, apart from anything else, postponing it arguably triggered that vote of confidence anyway, but whatever, she won that. So anyway, let me know what you think. If you've enjoyed the video, please don't forget to click the subscribe button, bell notification as well, so you can be notified for further content. Share with others who might also be interested. Now, until next time, I'll see you later.